Welcome to Old Cahaba, home of Alabama's first state capital. Though you wouldn't know it from looking around today, Old Cahaba was once home to more than 3,000 people. Nestled between the Alabama River and the Cahaba River, Old Cahaba was established in 1818. While this is a beautiful location for a town, the rivers would also be the town's downfall because of flooding and the town's close proximity to the two rivers. Today, Old Cahaba is all but abandoned, with the exception that it is now home to an archaeological park there to preserve what little remains of its history. But it was once a thriving town. One building that stood at this very spot was Salt Marsh Hall. It was the place where huge balls and parties were held. Even after the capital was moved to Tuscaloosa in 1825, Cahaba still remained the Dallas County seat until 1866. To accommodate that, the Dallas County Courthouse was built here in this area in 1834. After the war, the courthouse was used by freedmen who wished to gain political power. The building itself was dismantled by brick salvagers in 1905. Old Cahaba also had a vast variety of merchants, among them the old brick store, which stood in this very spot. It sold a variety of dry goods and was owned by Samuel Hill, who traveled to New York twice a year to stock up on merchandise for the town. Also, there was a hometown drugstore called the Cahaba Drugstore, which called this very location its home. It was owned by Herbert Hudson and J.D. Craig. Next door to the drugstore was a jewelry store and a grocery store. All of these stores were owned by members of the same family. Another famous Old Cahaba attraction is the Cushionron columns. These 3 columns are all that remain of a once grand house that stood at this location. This particular house was special because it was the first house in the state of Alabama to have air conditioning. The air conditioning worked when water from this artesian well was pumped through the pipes in the walls of the house, cooling it. This is the Kelly House, and it has returned home to Old Cahaba after being purchased on eBay of all places. It had been sold and removed by a man from Chicago who wanted to restore it but changed his mind and put it on eBay for auction. The Kelly House will be restored and made into a new welcome center for Old Cahaba, with the old one being made into a park office. Among the most well-known structures of Old Cahaba is St. Luke's Episcopal Church, which still stands today, just not in its original location. The church was dismantled and moved in 1878 to Martin Station, where it was used for worship by an Episcopal congregation and then later an African Baptist congregation who used it for 60 years. In 2007, students from Auburn University undertook the dismantling, relocation, and rebuilding of the church, which was complete in 2009. A new location for the church was selected because its original location was in a flood-prone area. It is now located next to the Old Cahaba Archaeological Park Welcome Center. Another well-known and still standing structure is the Barker Slave Quarters. In front of the slave quarters originally stood a larger main house, which burned down in 1935. You can still see the remains of the 4 corners of the house today. After the main house burned, the Kirkpatrick family converted the former slave quarters into their new home, adding a porch to the front and a much larger section to the back, more than doubling the size of the original structure. After the Civil War, the Kirkpatrick family was one of just a few families to stay in Cahaba. Clifton Kirkpatrick would become known as the Duke of Cahaba because he was the unofficial host of the town and gave tours to visitors. The last of the Kirkpatricks moved away in 1940. While little remains of it today, another long-lost part of Old Cahaba is Castle Morgan, a prison where Union soldiers were held during the Civil War. Located on a bank of the Alabama River, the prison was large enough to house around 500 people, but at the height of the war, more than 3,000 men were being held there. Still standing today, though only barely, the Fambrough House is probably the most famous of Old Cahaba's exhibits. The house was built in 1840 by William Fambrough, who lived there with his wife Elizabeth and their adopted daughter Mary. The Fambroughs housed a great number of guests, many of whom were students who needed a place to stay. The house was later bought by Ezekiel Arthur, a freedman who traveled around from state to state, finding members of his family taken by slavery. And finally, Old Cahaba's new cemetery is anything but, with citizens of Old Cahaba being interred in the cemetery from 1848 through 1900. Of those buried there are the Bells, a father and son who attacked a local man and were killed in a shootout when the man's brother-in-law came to his aid, and also the Gardner family, whose kind matriarch, Mrs. Gardner, brought books, blankets, and food to Union soldiers being held at Castle Morgan, in hopes that should her son, a Confederate soldier, be captured, he would be shown the same kindness by someone like her.